Hello, this is Rita Nakashima Brock again, back to talk to you today about recovery strategies for moral injury. So I'm going to do another PowerPoint, and we will also have the PDF of this available for you after this is over. This is recovery strategies for moral injury. And I'm going to begin with this statement, which I believe is really important to keep in mind when you're talking about recovery strategies. We may feel broken individually and suffer individually, but we recover collectively, because moral injury is a breakdown in a meaning system and identity and all the things that connect us to other people in authentic and loving ways. And so this diagram, I think, represents both the complexities of moral injury and the various dimensions of life it affects, but also then the various approaches into processes for recovery. So you don't have to do everything. Even just one thing might make a difference. So you have the element of moral conscience involved, which is the agent involved in making judgments that lead to moral injury related to devastating experiences. And then there's the creativity of people, the artistry, the ways that we relate to our environment in creative ways that enable change. And there's a dimension of spirituality, the soul or the spirit of the person that's also engaged with the process of recovery. Through spiritual discernment. And sometimes people talk of moral injury as a spiritual impasse. So there's a way through the impasse. And there's also the process of ritual, which I will be talking about soon in this talk quite a bit. And narrative and aesthetic creativity as well. So all of these are part of the process of collective deliberation, healing, and restoration that leads to resilience and repair. And as I said in my previous lecture, moral injury is not a disorder. It is an appropriate response to devastating life conditions. So the process is not to fix people or to help them reorient to reality in a way that's appropriate. They're relating to reality in an appropriate way, which is to be profoundly affected by it. So the process of repair is not to fix the person, but to enable the person to come to terms of accepting what happened and processing the feelings involved so that the experience itself becomes a source of repair and wisdom in their lives and not just a terrible thing that's driving negative emotions. So I'm going to talk about rituals and then religious rituals, spiritual practices. All of those are related to various developments in religious traditions. Writing, arts of various sorts, the role of nature and beauty, peer support, and also therapeutic approaches. So rituals are extremely important, I suggest. I think it may be the most important element in helping people recover. I've learned that through our own process of work we do with veterans, and I'll talk about that later. But rituals in a collective context, not for individuals, but in a collective context, enable significant change. So that individuals are changed, but it's not them having to do the work alone. Rituals integrate chaos, all the things that are devastating and difficult in life to handle. Almost every society that I know of anyway has ritual processes for handling those devastating things. So things like death and loss, and how do you include appropriate strangers, handle sickness, sexuality, gender relationships and roles, birth, moral failure, and that's the moral injury piece, moral failure and violence. rituals are the way most societies handle forces in life that powerful. And so you see, these are three illustrations here of powerful forces. The first one at the top and the one on the lower left are adolescent rituals for girls, in which they are, in their tradition, performing the role of adult women as a signal that they are, in this ritual, changing status from being girls to becoming women. So it doesn't mean that they suddenly are magically turned into women. It means that they have performed well enough through the ritual to have moved into a status they will be taking on. And so you have a bat mitzvah. So the girl is reading in Hebrew from the Torah. In the lower corner, you see, I think this is an Apache version of this. A number of Pueblo tribes have this kind of adolescent ritual for girls. And I think this is the last thing they do, which is that she cooks a giant corn cake for the community. So she does and enacts roles that women do in the society to show that she is becoming a female adult. And that's an important thing to mark in most societies, because adolescence, the bodily transition and the ways we sort of move into adult life from being children to being adults is a long process, and it's relatively complicated, and it's also biological. So to have a way to honor that thing that's happening and give it a shape and form and a way of addressing it is important. And that's true for death as well. We have to have ways that we can let go and acknowledge that death has happened. And this is an acknowledgement of a biological change in girls' bodies. And in boys have them too. There's bar mitzvahs for boys. And then there's a different kind of change that's acknowledged in the photograph on the right of a baptism. It's a Christian baptism. And in some traditions, infants are baptized, but in others, they call it believer's baptism. You have to make a confession of faith. You have to actually acknowledge that something has changed in you that is brought about by being baptized, where you enter a different status in the community as a member, as someone who's been changed by faith. And that is another way to mark ways that people change. So rituals both kind of embody the change and confirm it and acknowledge it. And that's important in societies to give structure to those changes. So how rituals do this kind of work, and it's tough work to do, is that they happen in what is called liminal space. So when a ritual begins, it's happening outside of ordinary space and time. And sometimes even special buildings, churches or synagogues or temples, are made specifically for ritual so that they can take place in that space, and you don't do anything in there that's ordinary time, like, work at your job or something. It's a special, or to shop or something. It's like you're there for the ritual. It's a dedicated space, often decorated with lots of things to signify what's going to happen inside that space. And whatever happens inside that space has its own time. It is not on a secular mechanical clock. It's really that the ritual is what makes the time happen and the flow of time. And it's certainly there are rituals that happen where there is an end time, but basically that end time is still part of the ritual process. And that liminal space in time gives room for what could be, for imagination, for beauty, for art, for all kinds of things to happen that in ordinary life you wouldn't be doing. And also there's often storytelling involved, or narrative or enactment of things that engage your feelings in an empathetic way, where you connect to things, you connect to a story. You might in that story, see something of yourself in one of the characters or in things that happen. So there's also an emotional process happening in a ritual. And so the rituals allow for that kind of creative engagement that actually can change a person. They can listen to a story and realize they empathize with one of the characters, and it changes them in relation to what the story is about. And often rituals are used as ways to integrate strangers or people outside a relationship into relationship to each other. So in colonial, during the time of colonialism in North America, a number of indigenous tribes had what some people called a weeping greeting, or a process of when they lost members of their tribe to war or disease and their numbers were decimated, if they encountered strangers or even took captives of war, they had adoption rituals so that these people could be taken into the tribe as members, as actual embodiments of the tribe itself, so that they replenish their numbers that way. And French trappers in the 16th, 17th century report these experiences of being adopted as they were wandering around by tribes. And they're really quite intense rituals of grief and then integration. And you can imagine weddings are that kind of ritual, right? So two people who decide they want to marry bring with them whole families. And often at those places, in those rituals of marriage, people get together as families that don't know each other. So it's a way to integrate this strangeness of people into a whole. And it's not that they suddenly are best friends or suddenly, no, this is like their acknowledgement that they're actually part of a clan now, and they have relationships with each other, even if they don't formally know each other. So rituals do these things. They're very powerful that way. And it's very different from just throwing a bunch of strangers in a room and saying, well, get to know each other, without any instruction on how to do it. So those are things that happen. Another really important quality of ritual, which is why I think it's so important for addressing moral injury, is that rituals actually override personal sincerity. In other words, how a person as an individual might feel in entering into a ritual may or may not be all that important to what's going to happen to them in the ritual. So, for example, and I think one of the best examples of how ritual works to override personal sincerity and change people is boot camp in the military, where it's kind of irrelevant whether you like what you're doing or what your personal reasons are for having enlisted and what your personal objectives are for being in the military. You just go through all the ritual activities of boot camp until everything is automatic. Because part of the way ritual works, it's like training. You just repeat until it's automatic. And once something is automatic, it's deeply implanted in your body system. So marching, eating, sleeping, saluting, all these things, shooting, all of these things that are trained into people at boot camp are trained in by repetition and by stories and values about why this is important to do. But how you personally feel at any given time about having to get up at 6 a.m. and run for 5 miles isn't important. And eventually you may even begin to enjoy doing it, or you may always hate it. But the ritual itself override your personal sincerity for the sake of the group and the relationships. This is how boot camp, if you mess up, your whole group is penalized. So it's part of your relationship to your group. And rituals do this. They establish group relationships within the ritual process through connection, and often through deep emotional connection. So in a boot camp process, you get a unit at the end of people, whether or not they personally like each other as best friends, are willing to die for each other, which is a pretty profound change from a group of strangers to that in 9 to 12 weeks. So rituals have that capacity. And I think with moral injury, it's especially helpful because people come in personally feeling really terrible. But when they begin to experience others who understand how they feel and validate how they feel, don't try to fix how they feel, but just say, yes, this really is awful. And that validation is a way that somebody's experience that may be really devastating might be helpful to someone else. And so it changes a little bit, maybe how they feel about their own experience, that it connects them to someone else, it doesn't isolate them from someone else. And so rituals have that power to override personal sincerity for the sake of change through connection. And that gives them what's called a subjunctive mood, an as-if quality, so that people can actually go from where they personally feel into a different space as if they could be in that space, and eventually they get there. So it has this performance toward change that is as if this reality existed. You enact it in hopes that it will exist. So rituals have that kind of power. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the program that we developed for veterans that uses ritual extensively, and the fact and how it was very effective. This is one form of ritual that Veterans Affairs clinics in some parts of the US have begun to adapt for non-Native veterans, using Native American leaders to run these ceremonials. And the most common one is a sweat lodge. And the report of it is in an article by Chris Webb for the journal Sapiens, in which he's an anthropologist out of Duke University who for his dissertation project studied the non-Native use of Native American rituals, partly because as an Iraq veteran himself, he found them incredibly helpful. Even though he was getting treated for PTSD at the VA, he found that the Native American sweat lodge was profoundly helpful. And they go through a number of these sweat experiences. It's very intense. I've done them myself, not for moral injury purposes, but as an immersion experience at Rosebud Reservation. And it's sort of a sauna steam bath combination, but you're in this dark place, you can't see anything, and you're naked. I don't know if they're naked in the VA, but the one I did in Rosebud was we had nothing but a towel, and it's basically an act of prayer. And what the leader told Chris Webb, who wrote the article, was that what we're going to teach you is to stop needing to fight people. And so the process of deep immersion in prayer and listening to other people's prayers is that process of being cleansed of needing to fight people. And that's one version of a ritual process. The Dene enemy way, Dene is the chosen word for Navajo. Navajo is what the people who oppose them call them. So the Dene enemy way ceremony is designed specifically for people who have encountered death in an irregular way. So they have encountered death of a non-Dene person, or a violent death, or just irregular contact with ghosts of the dead. And so it's Tony Hillerman, the murder mystery writer, was a World War II veteran who got interested in this ceremony when he came back as a reporter for the Star Tribune in Minnesota. And he got so taken with the world of the Dene and the rituals that they use that he wrote this murder mystery series on the reservation, the Navajo reservation. And the first book was about this ceremonial, in which it takes days. Chester Nez in his book Code Talker also describes it. It takes days, and the person who does the chant does the sand painting on the floor that you see in the picture on the lower right. And that represents the world of the world of the beings and deities and people and nature, the world that the Navajo or the Diné live in, that they seek to be in harmony with. And so the person who is being treated sits on that sand and goes through all kinds of chants and rituals and activities that go on for days, and the whole community is invited to be there to support the person. And after a number of days, and the number of days is prescribed by a diagnostician who interviews the person and decides what they need. And at the end, the sand has been stirred up to the point that the images are understood to have re-entered the person's body and healed them. So that's another process that's used by a community in helping someone recover from what would be called moral injury. There's also the possibility of what I call sui generis, or self-created rituals that groups can do that also work really quite powerfully. And this is a picture from one that our first group of veterans who went through our resilient strength training program, which is our moral injury processing program. It's peer facilitated. So the person standing in the middle who's holding the object, that's Robert. He was a peer facilitator for the group. And the two people on either side of him were members of the group. There were 7 women in the group, and the other co-facilitator was an African-American woman. This group of veterans, at the last day that they were meeting, wanted to have a fire. And this was happening in Southern California, which is not a real safe place to have open fires. So the retreat center agreed to set up a little barbecue pit in a concrete area so there wouldn't be any fire danger. And the reason the group asked for this, I think, is partly because we described the feelings of moral injury as intensely painful, and the willingness to stay with them, with each other, empathetically and compassionately, but also with their own feelings, was a process of sitting in the fire. It was so fierce, but that process, as they burned through the fire, would eventually help them to burn clean of all the intense feelings and lower the heat on those feelings. So they asked us if then at the last night they could have this fire. And this was a ritual they invented themselves. This was not something we had built into our resilient strength training program for them at the end. And then they also, to do it, invited us, who had not been in the group. I was the project director for this pilot program, and there's an administrator, backup clinician, who is just there on site with me to make sure everything goes well, and if any kind of psychological intervention is needed, the person is there. So we spend our days doing work or talking to each other or running errands for the group. But we did not participate in what happened. So we were honored that they invited us to be at this ritual that they'd had with the fire. And I think they invited us because they were so pleased with themselves, so grateful for all that they've been through that they could now name. And so the ritual was involved with us standing in a circle around the fire, and everybody had brought a list of things they needed to get, that they were ready to let go of and put in the fire that they had burned through. And so the ritual was that each person, after they lit the fire, they went in order in the circle, and each person read from what they had written, and then they placed their paper in the fire, and the group silently received the list and waited for the paper to burn completely up. And then the next person shared their list. And we went around that way. And then at the end, everybody held hands and they had a group cheer and then hugs all around. And it was really quite powerful to just be there for it and to participate by doing the group hug. But there were things that were shared, like a woman had written a letter during the week to her rapist, and she read the letter and said that she had forgiven him, and she put it into the fire. And the one that still just stays with me is one of the participants started out by saying, I had been in so much trauma, pain all my life that I didn't feel like myself if I wasn't in pain. And then she read from her list. I was sexually abused by multiple members of my family. My mother didn't love me. I joined the military for a better life and I got raped in the military. I was addicted to drugs and lost custody of my son and went to prison for a long time. And then I came out, and then I had another son, and we were living in my car when Volunteers of America put us in affordable housing for veterans with children. So she had been maybe a month in this housing facility that we had for veterans with children. And most of the women in the program came from that housing place. So everybody in the group had been unhoused at some point. So she read this list. And then she said, I realized this week that I don't have to be in pain. So I'm burning my pain. And she put the list in the fire. So there was something about that ritual that created a safe container to name the difficult process they'd been through and the outcome that they were happy with. It was self-created, and there are a number of ritual things that happened in this group that weren't in the plan, but that somehow the group wanted to do, and we were fine with that. This was such an effective one, we started using it in all of our groups. This process integrated the writing they had done during the week and some of the spiritual practices that helped them see their trauma in different ways. This ritual allowed them to have a narrative structure where it began with them reading, and then the fire consumed the things they were ready to let go of. So it was as if these terrible things that had happened to them were now given away to the spirit of the world or something. But it was a collective process of that kind of narrative structure of, we had this, we no longer need it, so we can give it away. And I think at the end gave them a quality of optimism or a hope that they hadn't arrived with at the beginning of their week together. And so we, in our program, don't use any rituals that are explicitly religious in terms of sectarian ideas. We use mindfulness a lot, and we call it that, but we don't necessarily attach it to a Buddhist cosmology or Buddhist system. We just explain to them that it's actually physically beneficial to your body for stress. So we do things like that with rituals. And we use mindfulness a great deal in this program. We also use other spiritual strategies. We actually had an hour a day that the group went through some kind of spiritual practice, that like yoga or Tai Chi, or in this case, labyrinth walking. And we found labyrinth walking actually was very powerful. And it turns out to be multi-religious anyway. There are a lot of traditions that use labyrinths. But the spiritual strategies have the effect of shifting from thought to body awareness. So the breathing, the walking, the stretching, the movement itself requires some attention, and it sort of moves you away from all the perseverating thoughts that may make you miserable. And it also frees the breath and the body by lowering cortisol and stress, and engaging the body in movements and things that help calm the body as well. And it also allows people to be aware of how they're feeling, but not necessarily driven by how they're feeling. It's an interesting calming process. You can also use spiritual strategies to energize. We use them at the end of a tough day of processing to calm people down so they could sleep. We also used a great deal of writing. We had them journal when they weren't meeting, but we also, during the meetings, used a process of free writing. which is a way of writing where you don't stop writing. And often because you're compulsively writing it, you start to put things down that your mind doesn't necessarily entirely control. We use a teeny bit of poetry writing, but not much. I know a friend of mine who started a poetry writing group in the Kansas City Public Library. He's a battalion surgeon from the Vietnam era who was a doctor and a retired doctor now. And he started this poetry writing group because he's a published poet. And it's been an interesting process where they bring in poetry professors and they bring in veterans like Tim O'Brien, who have published, who are veterans, to talk about what it's like to write about their veteran experience. And it's a group that's now meets monthly, and it's been going for 6 or 7 years. And the Missouri Humanities Foundation in Kansas City has funded their conferences every year in the fall. And so that's been an interesting approach to helping people understand war trauma and moral injury. And they even write fiction stories now. It's not just poetry. And in fact, when Tim O'Brien was a speaker, their assignment in their poetry writing group was to write a backstory for a character in the novel whose backstory isn't told. So that was fun. I got to visit and hear some of those stories. It was wonderful. A lot of veterans and people who have suffered the kind of trauma that produces moral injury write memoirs, and some of them even get published. And that's an important process also because it helps you create a narrative for your life that isn't just the trauma. And that's an important part of relativizing its power, is to make it part of your story instead of the only thing that's true about you. And then there are veterans there are no number that have gone through the Emory University doctoral program in theology and ethics. Brian Powers, who wrote a book on his moral injury experience called Full Darkness, that was his doctoral thesis, is now director of the European Moral Injury Center, which he's founded at Durham University in the UK. And Michael Yandel, who's a senior minister of a church in Greensboro, North Carolina, who wrote his book, War and Negative Revelation. So some people process that way. And then there's new work now, commentary on texts and stories, and there's interesting approaches to reading texts with moral injury in mind, and that is useful both for identifying dimensions of moral injury and also helping people process. And as I said, we use free writing. This is a process, and we do pen and paper or pencil and paper if possible. If a person has a disability and has a hard time writing, then we ask them to use a voice memo on their phone, but not to type into a computer, because that's an automatic way of writing that doesn't work as well as hand to paper, because you can't write as fast as you can think. And so as you're writing, you're actually making choices, and and sometimes those are telling choices that get made, and that's not what happens when you're typing. So we use them to help people externalize their experiences and process them. It's a way of engaging the body and the mind together, the actual writing process itself, to release inner pain and memories. And we use free writing after every guided meditation or exercise to remember trauma, partly so that they have a record of what they remembered, and it gives them some control over how much they want to share, because they're not required to read what they wrote. So they have some management of how much emotional vulnerability they want to have, and so they don't feel overexposed. And this is another writing exercise we do that's a values clarification after the trauma processing and after they've done some of the storytelling, is that we ask them to think about what they used to believe and what they believe now. And we do this exercise also collectively, and we put post-it things on the board, and people can point to values they share with each other and create a group of collective values. It's sort of like building a new moral compass for the whole group. So this is a really interesting exercise to do that with. We also use visual art, and we use visual art because it's a way of being creative that actually feels good, even if you are creating things that are negative. So we asked them on the second day of our program to make a mask of their military face. And that's what you see at the top, is a picture of some of the masks that were made. And the thing with trauma is that it isn't always verbal. In fact, it's often not verbal, but it's physical, it's bodily, the bodily experience. And the masks and the visual art or the sculpting or whatever the art is often a more accurate way of just depicting what happened or how they feel than words themselves, because trauma is often not verbal. So, and it's also true that sometimes doing visual work bypasses your mental sensor or your verbal sensor. And so you have a picture of childhood trauma in the lower drawing that's pretty vivid and might not be something a person could say exactly in words. So it's also a way to take the nonverbal, depict it, and then be able to talk about it verbally. And then the other thing about doing any kind of artwork is it just lifts your spirits to be creative. And so to have to plan and figure out how you're going to depict something in a visual way is also can be a positive feeling. We also use movement, dance, music. Those all get integrated into the kinds of things we do, partly because they really lift spirits. They keep people from just going completely down into a negative space. I certainly know in singing in choirs that I always feel a whole lot better after 2 hours of choir practice. It just somehow focusing on the sound and the exactness of things really makes your body feel good and your spirit too. And then there's the quality of nature and beauty. That's just a sense of being gifted with something you didn't earn, and it's a sense of gratitude for that. It's also true that outdoor light is just really good for people. It's good for sleeping, it's good for spirits. So these are things that the natural world gives us that we do not have to do anything to do but go out and appreciate. That sensory shift toward appreciation also can help people move into more positive spaces while they're processing difficult things, and it's physically renewing. So in addition to all of the above strategies, arts, and spiritual practices, and ritual, we've ourselves here at Volunteers of America use pretty much exclusively peer specialist work. So this means that we use veterans in facilitating small groups of veterans. We use first responders with first responders. We also have programs for the general public we use, as we consider people as peer facilitators in those groups as ordinary people, no matter what their profession is, who are interested in supporting other people who experience moral distress and moral injury, because they understand what those things are and have processed some of those things themselves. So we call this peer specialist support. And the standard in peer specialist work is always to have a mental health specialist who debriefs and supports the specialist so that they're not alone in handling something that maybe is beyond what just an ordinary person can do that might require mental health support. But basically, what we found in doing this approach to recovery to moral injury is that, especially for groups that are tightly closed communities or cultures like law enforcement or veteran military folk, they're often mistrustful of people who haven't been through the experiences they've been through. And so having a person that they can trust to not judge them and not to think something that they did was just utterly inconceivable, that those responses that people outside those cultures might have is eliminated. And so it lowers the bar for trust and the ability of people to be vulnerable to each other without worrying about somebody wanting to fix them or judge them or have an opinion or diagnose them. And so we use it for that. The process of peer support really itself creates a way in which people's negative experiences can be of value to others, who either can show empathy and relate to how somebody's feeling, or maybe even had a similar experience. And that sense of that you're not alone in your suffering, and that also that what you've experienced might be of value to other people, changes your inner feelings about that experience. And so we found peer support groups helpful in that regard as well, because it also encourages people to take agency for their moral conscience that has led to their suffering, that conscience is a good thing, and that their suffering is because they have a conscience. So all of those things make our peer specialist approach to recovery from moral injury, and then using all of the strategies we describe above and training peer facilitators to implement them, has worked very well in our program with veterans, and we've adapted it to online much shorter programs for the public and for vets and first responders as well. So the final thing about a peer specialist support group is that it avoids that stigma that often affects people who work in teams and high stakes work, that if they seek help or support from mental health specialists, they're a weak link in the team, that there's something wrong with them, or they feel like it stigmatizes them. So a peer specialist program doesn't have those elements. And so it's not as seen, I think, as so stigmatizing, sometimes even as a gift, a great possibility for help. And as I said, we adapted our veterans program to this 1 hour process we call resilient strength time, or REST for short. And actually, you're welcome to go there yourself if you need an hour of just support from people because you had a difficult day or week or month. And we also have a special site that a grant helped us create for first responders, which means police, firefighters, ER staff, EMTs, paramedics, dispatchers, international aid workers, people who are on the scene immediately in the aftermath of tragedies. So if they meet multiple times a week, you just go to the link and register, and you can see the schedule of times and pick a time that might work for you. We use mindfulness, we use capacities for people to deeply listen with empathy, we use guided meditation, and things like that in these hour-long processes. We also, in our veterans group, use this, what I'm going to talk about now are more therapeutic approaches that might be implemented as well in helping people recover from moral injury. We've used this Buddhist therapeutic practice called Nikon, which literally means looking inward with your mind's eye, or looking inside, sort of examining, a self-examination process. And it was, created in a Buddhist interdependent culture that prioritizes relationships and families rather than individuals. And so what they do is they help people with key relationships from the beginning of their lives. That's usually their mother or one of their parents, and help them, no matter how troubled the relationship was, recognize that there was some kindness or love in the relationship, even if there was harm also. And that remembrance of love, that just even a glimpse that at one point you were worthy of love and someone loved you, is really important for creating a narrative arc to a life story that isn't just trauma-based. And so this therapeutic practice uses the first 3 questions listed here. People go to temples and they engage in this practice by writing for 12 to 15 hours a day on these 3 questions related to the person they're writing about for life segments. So the first 5 years of their life is 1 day, the next is 5 more years of their life, until they complete the point at which they're in the present. And the questions, as you can see here, are: what did you receive from the person? What did you give to the person? And what problems did you cause the person? And we used this exercise at the beginning of our trauma processing time in our veterans 50-hour program to help them remember love. And so we added this question: how do you feel about the person now, as part of this writing exercise? And they write for 20 minutes, not for 15 hours. but we find that people find it helpful. And so we've used it in other contexts as well, but especially with our veterans is very helpful. And then there's this protocol that clinicians in San Francisco at the VA there worked it throughout to help therapists who don't really understand moral injury very well or haven't thought about it, understand the impact of killing, because there's a double suicide rate for veterans who've killed in combat as opposed to veterans who have not. And so they created this 10-step protocol that can be inserted into a therapeutic process for a mental health disorder. And they're very clear to say in this treatment outline that the goal of this process is not to help people reorient to the present by shaping their thinking to be more accurate to what they experienced, because how devastating they feel is an accurate response to a devastating thing like killing. So the goal is to help people come to accept what happened to them, and to do things that might resolve some of the terrible moral emotions they are feeling, like writing letters of unfinished business, figuring out how they might come to a point of self-forgiveness, things like that. So I'm just mentioning this here in case some of you are clinicians, and you might find this helpful, not just for veterans, but for example, police officers or other people in jobs where sanctioned violence can happen, or just inadvertently you can wind up harming someone or failing to save them. So this might, I think, be helpful if adapted in those kind of ways as well. And then there is, of course, in the early work by the Brett Litz team, the 2016 book called Adaptive Disclosure, which is on the reading list. And in that, and as well as the 2009 essay that they published that defines moral injury, they have an 8-step protocol called Adaptive Disclosure that involves role playing and imagining a conversation with a benevolent moral authority and things like that. So there's also that, if you're a therapist, that you might be able to integrate into other forms of therapy that you're using with people you might suspect have moral injury as well. So I just want to leave you with this diagram. One of the great gifts in my life has been for the, working on moral injury since 2009. I've met a lot of veterans, not just veterans, but especially veterans who were, it was like the first time they'd ever heard the term moral injury was some event that I was at or helped plan. And to watch the journey that they've been on over the years as I've stayed in touch with them, as you can see that they're constantly processing their moral injury. They're constantly reevaluating and thinking about their experience in ways that cycle through other things happening around them that inform how they're thinking about it. But what I notice in that processing is that they've come to a more settled, often place as they evolve. And as a friend of mine, Tyler Boudreau, who writes on moral injury, once said at a conference that he spoke at, he said, if you have somebody who's telling their moral injury story exactly the same way every time, it means they're hiding something. They're hiding behind the story and not processing. So that people think differently at different points in their lives about their moral injury is actually a sign of health. It's actually a sign that their consciences continue to process it and think about it. And so it's not running their life in a stuck way that it keeps unfolding for them, and sometimes becomes a real source of wisdom or motivation to do things in their lives that are positive. So just remember, moral injury is there's not like a sudden cure or a way that it goes away, because you're never going to forget what happened. You just keep relating to it in different ways. And just want to mention that we have a Facebook group that's a private group called Moral Injury, a Community of Practice. We post new articles we think are of interest there. We post notices about events and people post questions. You're welcome to join that Facebook group. And also our Shay newsletter every month mentions things we've noticed that have been published that are worthy of note, and any other things that we think would be of interest to our constituents and people who've gone through this program. So, and the resources list that's been at the end of all of my 3 PDFs for these lectures is the comprehensive list for all 3 of the lectures. So it's the same list for every one of them. And the little footnotes refer to this resource list at the end of the slideshow. So I'm going to stop there and thank you. This is my last lecture for this certificate program. And I want to, thank you all for being part of it, and hope that the things I've shared with you have been helpful, and wish you well with the rest of your process in this program. Thank you.